Psychology. The science of mental processes and behaviors. Mental processes. Activities of our brains when engaged in thinking, observing the environment, and using language. Behavior. Observable activities of an organism often in response to environmental cues. Culture. A set of shared beliefs and practices that are transmitted across generations. Consciousness. Personal awareness of ongoing mental processes, behaviors, and environmental events. Voluntarism. Belief that much of behavior is motivated and that attention is focused for an explicit purpose. Structuralism. Belief that the mind is a collection of sensory experiences. Study should be focused on mental processes rather than on an explanation of mechanisms underlying those processes. Introspection. Method of psychological study endorsed by Wundt and his followers, involving careful evaluation of mental processes and how they expand simple thoughts into complex ideas. Functionalism. Belief that mental processes have purpose and that focus of study should be on how the mind adapts those purposes to changing environments. Gestalt psychology. Field of psychology arguing that we have inborn tendencies to structure what we see in particular ways and to structure our perceptions into broad perceptual units. Unconscious. Hypothesized repository of thoughts, feelings, and sensations outside human awareness, thought in some theories to have a strong bearing on human behavior. Psychoanalytic theory. Psychological theory that human mental processes are influenced by the competition between unconscious and conscious forces. Behaviorism. Branch of psychology thought arguing that psychology should study only directly observable behaviors, rather than abstract mental process. Stimuli. Elements of the environment that trigger changes in our internal or external states. Response. The way we react to stimuli. Reinforcement. Leaning process in which the consequence resulting from a behavior will increase or decrease the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. Humanistic psychology. Theory of psychology that sought to give greater prominence to special and unique features of human functioning. Client-centered therapy. Approach to therapy founded by Carl Rogers, based on the notion that clients will make positive gains if therapists mirror their thoughts and feelings in an atmosphere of unconditional positive Cognitive psychology. Field of psychology studying mental processes as forms of information processing, or the way in which information is stored and operated in our minds. Information processing. Means by which information is stored and operated internally. Cultural psychology. The study of how cognitive processing varies across different populations. Neuroscience. Study of psychology functions by looking at biological foundations of those functions. Behavioral genetics. Subfield of psychology looking at the influence of genes on human behavior. Sociobiologists. Theorists who believe humans have a genetically innate concept of how social behavior should be organized. Evolutionary psychology. A field of study that applies evolutionary ideas to the explanation of human behavior. Cultural universality. Behaviors and practices that occur across all cultures. Academic psychology. Branch of psychology focusing on research and instruction in the various areas or fields of study in psychology. Applied psychology. Branch of psychology that applies psychology principles to help solve practical problems in education, marketing, and other fields. Clinical and counseling psychology. The study of abnormal psychological behavior and interventions designed to change that behavior. Collectivist culture whose members focus more on the needs of the group than of the individual. Individualistic culture that places the wants or desires of the person over the needs of the group. Cognitive neuroscience. Study of mental processes and how they relate to the biological functions of the brain. Social neuroscience. Study of social functioning and how it is tied to brain activity. Positive psychology. A movement in psychology that focuses on the positive features of human functioning and examines how they might be developed more readily. What is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of mental processes and human behavior. When studying why a certain behavior occurs, one can study the influences of the brain, the person, the group. What are the levels of analysis? The brain, the person, the group. What is analyzed on the brain level? how the brain structure and brain cell activity differ from person to person and situation to situation. What is analyzed on the person level? How the context of the individual's mental processes form and influence behavior. What is analyzed on the group level? How behavior is shaped by the social and cultural environments. Given a randomly selected person, describe what you would gather about their brain, using the levels of analysis. You would gather the patterns of that person's brain activation and how they seek to interact with others. Given a randomly selected person, describe what you would gather about that person, using the levels of analysis. You would gather the values of that person, their personal characteristic, personality, habits, demeanor, etc. Given a randomly selected group of people, describe what you would gather about that group, using the levels of analysis. You would gather the participation of that group, with whom do they affiliate with, do they interact with similar groups, or dissimilar groups, or are they generally isolated from society? What is philosophy? The study and knowledge and reality? Which group of academics lead to the creation of scientific theory? Philosophers. Which philosopher used direct observation to test his theory of medicine? Hippocrates. What theory led to the development of medicine? Who was the creator of that theory? The theory of medicine, which was created by Hippocrates. Who is known as the father of psychology, established the first psychology lab in 1879, and started a branch of psychology known as voluntarism. Wilhelm Wundt. What is structuralism? Structuralism is an attempt to try and identify all of the elements of the consciousness. Name an element of structuralism. Introspection. What is introspection? Looking within yours to identify conscious elements. Who founded structuralism? Edward Titchener, who was a student of Wundt, and established the first psychology laboratory in the United States. Edward Titchener. Where was the first psychology laboratory founded? Cornell University. What is functionalism? The belief that mental processes were fluid, instead of fixed elements as structuralism thought. Functionalism emphasizes the mind's ability to adapt to the environment. Who founded functionalism? William James. This individual was the first psychologist in the United States, taught at Harvard University, wrote the first psychology textbook, Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1890. William James. What is Gestalt psychology? It was a concept that stated that consciousness cannot be broken down into smaller elements. We perceive things as holistic perceptual units. What is psychoanalysis? The belief that a person's behaviors are based on their unconscious desires. Who founded psychoanalysis? Sigmund Freud. Which form of therapy was designed to resolve unconscious conflicts? Psychoanalysis. This psychologist invented psychoanalysis blank. Sigmund Freud. What is behaviorist psychology? The belief that the scientific investigation of psychology should be focused only on the behavior that you can see. Who found behaviorist psychology? Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, B. F. Skinner. This psychologist found that dogs could associate a bell with an automatic behavior, such as salivation to food. He believed that he had learned how behaviors are learned. Ivan Pavlov. This psychologist conducted the Little Albert experiment, and solidified classical conditioning. John B. Watson. This psychologist developed operant conditioning, which is a form of psychology that uses reinforcement and punishment to condition its participant, and shape behaviors. B. F. Skinner. What is humanistic psychology? This form of psychology stresses a person's capacity for personal growth, freedom to choose his or her destiny, and positive qualities. Who founded humanistic psychology? Carl Rogers. Which psychologist developed client-centered therapy, which stated that people are innately good? Carl Rogers. Which psychologist developed the theory of motivation that consists of a hierarchy of needs? Abraham Maslow. What is cognitive psychology? It focused on the important role of mental processes in how people process information, develop language, solve problems, and think. The development of computers in neuroscience helped to create this field. Cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology was created by blank. Ulrich Neusser, who coined the term psychology as the study of information processing. Ulrich Neusser. What is cultural psychology? The study of how cognitive processes vary across different cultures, which cognitive processes are universal, and which apply only to specific cultural domains. Physiology is theory-driven, empirical, based on research, multi-level, brain, individual, social, contextual, based on cultural context. Clinical and counseling psychologist work is blank. Therapist. Academic psychologist work is blank. Professors, both teaching and research. Applied psychologist work in blank. Schools, marketing firms, research institutions, applying psychological skills to real-life situations. Name two of the four goals discussed in the text that psychologists have in mind when studying mental processes and behavior. Identify two of the following goals: description, explanation, prediction, and control. Name the three levels of analysis that are apparent in psychological research. Brain. At the brain level of analysis, psychologists examine how brain structure and brain cell activity differ from person to person and situation to situation. Person. At the person level of analysis, psychologists examine how the content of the individual's mental processes forms and influences behavior. Group. At the brain level of analysis, psychologists examine how social and cultural environments shape behavior. Why is behavioral analysis incomplete without an examination of the group? Humans are shaped by their social environments, and those environments change over time. How is psychological science of today similar to primitive myths? Both approaches are attempts to describe, explain, predict, and control our reality. Describe how the work of Aristotle influenced the development of psychology as a scientific discipline. Promoting the empirical investigation of topics such as sensations and learning laid the foundations of the scientific investigation of behavior. Describe Wundt's investigation of voluntarism. Wundt studied the will, believed that behavior is motivated and attention is focused for an explicit purpose. What was the major criticism of structuralism? Structuralism relies too heavily on describing behavior rather than applying the knowledge about the human mind in a practical manner. If a clock is analogous to the human mind, describe how structuralists and functionalists would vary in their research approaches and interests. Structuralists would be primarily interested in the components of the clock, whereas functionalists would be interested in how the clock performs in a variety of situations. A famous artistic style known as pointillism uses small colored points of paint to create an image. When humans look at such a painting, they see a distinct image rather than a bunch of points. According to Gestalt principles, humans are predisposed to combine information into a cohesive whole, rather than focus on its parts. According to Freud, how do childhood experiences contribute to later psychological functioning? Developmental milestones must be achieved successfully for a child to reach emotional adjustment. This occurs such that a child learns from effective and ineffective interactions between conscious and unconscious forces. Provide an example that illustrates how conditioning can occur in animals. Example must provide a link between a stimulus and a response. Distinguish between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement increases the likelihood of a desired outcome, whereas negative reinforcement decreases the likelihood of an undesirable outcome. Provide an example of how a child might learn from social observation. Children model the behaviors they observe in others. Define information processing and describe how this idea relates to cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is the study of information processing, defined as the means by which information is stored and operates internally in the human mind. Define cultural universality and describe why evolutionary psychologists seek these behaviors. Cultural universality refers to behaviors and practices that occur across all cultures. Evolutionary psychologists believe that such knowledge will inform them about the impact of biological factors on our development. Make a distinction between academic and applied psychologists. Academic psychologists often work at colleges and universities, where they divide their time between teaching and conducting research, whereas applied psychologists use their expertise to guide decisions and work outside of academic settings. Make a distinction between clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. Psychiatrists have less training in psychological research and testing, but they have more medical knowledge and can prescribe medications. How do counseling psychologists differ from psychiatric social workers? Psychiatric social workers provide aid to families through social service systems available in the community. Explain what is meant by the statement, psychology is contextual. Advances in technology and changes in society force us to examine behavior from new perspectives that broaden our awareness. How is cognitive psychology different from cognitive neuroscience? While both areas of research investigate mental processes, cognitive neuroscience attempts to link processes to particular brain activities, while cognitive psychology investigates the internal mental processes of thought. Describe the challenge that psychology faces in achieving a balance between popular trends, societal influences, and scientific objectivity. Psychology, like all sciences, may be influenced by fads and fashions, but the scientific method will continue to be the means by which we seek knowledge. By definition, what do psychologists study? Behavior and mental processes. What is one direct method of investigating internal mental processes that has resulted from technological advances within psychology? Brain imaging. At what level of behavioral analysis does a psychologist analyze the content of mental processes, including emotions, thoughts, and ideas? The individual. What attribute of Greek culture was essential to forming intellectual dialogue that resulted in a flow of ideas? Open, critical discussions where anyone could challenge prevailing doctrines. According to Hippocrates, what are humours? Bodily fluids that determine a person's character and well-being. What theory postulates that all life on Earth is related and that humans are just one outcome of many variations from a common ancestor? Evolution. Why was introspection criticized as a scientific technique? Findings were often diverse depending on who was using the technique and what they were investigating. What topic was investigated in an early experiment by Bryan and Harter in 1897? How quickly typing skills could be learned by telegraph operators. Gestalt is a German term that roughly translates to what word in English? Whole or form. Where did Freud obtain evidence for his psychoanalytic theory? From information he obtained from patients in his medical practice. Define what behaviorists were interested in studying. Behaviorism is founded on the belief that psychologists should only study directly observable behaviors rather than abstract mental processes. who first proposed that animal findings could help to explain human behavior. Thorndike. Provide an example of a reinforcing behavior. Example must name something that is rewarding, desirable, and that the behavior is likely to be repeated over time. According to Bandura, what mechanism describes how children learn? Social observation or modeling. What approach to psychotherapy did Carl Rogers develop that supported therapists respecting and treating their clients as equals? Client-centered therapy. Describe the goal of behavioral genetics. Explore the influence of genes on cognition and behavior. Academic psychology carries on the mission to seek pure scientific knowledge by conducting research and instruction on a wide variety of psychological topics. Who is most often associated with this mission? Wundt. What is the purpose of applied psychology? Involves the application of psychological principles to help solve practical problems. What area of psychology was described in the text when defining applied branches of psychology? Sports psychology. Beyond the provision of psychotherapy, what work do counseling psychologists do? Family therapy for issues involving careers, child rearing, and relationships. List the 4 values about psychology that academic, applied, and clinical counseling psychologists share. Psychology is theory-driven, empirical, multi-level, and contextual. What 3 levels of behavioral analyses do psychologists consider to gain a complete understanding of human mental processes and behavior? Brain, person, and group. On a recent trip to Asia, Jasmine noticed that some of the cultures she encountered seemed to emphasize the needs of the group more than their individual needs. What type of culture did Jasmine most likely experience on her trip to Asia? Collectivist. What technological development from the 1950s and 1960s contributed to the cognitive psychology revolution? Computers. What new form of therapy focuses on increasing clients' sense of engagement rather than targeting specific symptoms of mental dysfunction? Positive psychotherapy.